In the lore community, we discuss the fall of Kandria quite frequently, with good reason as that kickstarted the traveler's whole journey. However, there is an arguably bigger event that doesn't get as much spotlight when it really should, the Archon War. We know the outcome of this war, we know when it ended, but we don't know how or when it began, or exactly what went down. And if we start looking a little harder, we will find that there is a lot more we don't know. So today, I'm going to go over all these weird details and discrepancies and suggest my own speculations along the way. Please keep in mind that theories are only worth so much, and I wouldn't even call this a theory, just an assorted collection of thoughts. First and foremost, let us look at what the game tells us about the Archon War. According to a scholar named Soraya, these battles were fought over 7 celestial seats. So far so good, this seems to match up with what we have experienced in-game. Namely, each of the 7 Archons possesses a Gnosis that corresponds to their element. So the Gnosis could be a metaphorical seat, or it might be referring to something more literal, like actual access to Celestia granted to the gods in possession of a Gnosis. And if this is the case, the Archon War would have been Celestia ordered, which doesn't seem out of character. But here arises the first issue. We have a total of 7 elements: Anemo, Geo, Electro, Dendro, Hydro, Pyro, and Cryo, and each of these elements has a god ruling over it. Which begs the question, could we have gotten different elements? Say that 2 gods of the same element became Archons. Would we be down to 6? Is that even something that could happen, or did Celestia interfere to avoid this very scenario? We know that Liyue was established 3,700 years ago by Morax with the help of Marchosius and the other Adepti, but either acquiring a seat doesn't implicate a ceasefire and stealing another god's seat is fair game, or at the time Morax wasn't a Geo-Archon yet, as we still don't know how that is defined. One way or another, we know he fought both Oziel and Beisht, which are both Hydro. What would happen if they won? Would Liyue have been the Hydro Nation and Fontaine been assigned another element? Would the original Hydro Archon be unable to win just for being aligned with Hydro? That, assuming that the Hydro seat, if the seats are element specific, hadn't yet been claimed when Morax rose to power. 5 of the 7 original Archons have died and been replaced, and their replacement has always matched their element, which seems to imply that yes, Celestia very much wants to have each nation be ruled by a different element. But that still doesn't answer my question fully. Could we have gotten a different element? One that is not part of the 7 we know? Because they exist. The Abyss is often referred to as not being part of Tevat, but Tevat is just a continent, so they are still likely part of the same world. As such, Abyssal Power is a naturally occurring quote-unquote element of this world. There is also whatever Dainsleif wields, and I won't even bring the light element that Twins wield into the discussion, as even though everything we know points to the idea that it's just a combination of all 7 elements, we cannot tell whether there is something that naturally occurs in Tevat. Perhaps we could have gotten one of these elements, and the only reason why we didn't was because none of the gods fighting for a seat had an affinity with them. But we do know gods that possessed mastery over other elements still, namely Guizhong and Havria. The first was known as a god of dust and the latter as a god of salt. Now, I know what you're thinking, both dust and salt fall very neatly into Gia's domain. I agree, but the people of the Guili Assembly don't. The Guili Assembly was Liyue before current Liyue was a thing, plus Guizhong's people. It was an ancient civilization that resided in the Guili Plains and was ruled over by Guizhong and Morax. Their people had the helpful habit of writing down their history on stone tablets that survive to this day, and according to said tablets, in the beginning, when the people assembled to farm the land, a god named Guizhong descended, whose dominion was over dust, and whose reach shrouded the skies for thousands of miles around. The god laid down 4 commandments for the people. Then another god descended, whose dominion was over Geo, and who brought the people of Liyue to this place. Interestingly enough, the writer made the point to separate dust from Geo. Granted, this doesn't imply that dust isn't a subcategory of Geo, if you will. It's possible that Guizhong simply possessed dominion over a very small part of what was otherwise a more versatile element. And she's described as being very strong, but one thing doesn't necessarily invalidate the other. So what would happen if Guizhong had won? Would we have a playable dust element instead of Geo, or would she gain domain over the other components of Geo? And while we are on the topic of elements, what about gods that wield more than one? The Traveler has been painted as an exception for being able to use multiple elements, but they are definitely not the only creature who can do so. For instance, Zhongli's pet dragon, Ajdaha, can resonate with every element with the exception of Dendro and Anemo. Now, he is not a god, but there are actual gods that have 2 elements, namely Andreas, who has power over both Anemo and Cryo, and Marchosius, also known as Quoba, who, in his prime, had the mastery over Geo and Pyro. Dual wielding seems to be the exception rather than a norm among gods, but we need to consider that we mostly get to see the victors. There could have been a lot more gods who were not limited to a single element, but none of them survived, or they are all currently sealed away. So again, was the Celestia directly interfering? Did they take out gods they didn't want ruling over the humans? Maybe, but for the sake of the argument, let's assume that was not the case and that these gods simply failed to secure a seat in Celestia, meaning they did have the chance to win. So what would have happened if they did? Say that Andreas won. Would he both be the Cryo and Animo Archon? Would he lose one of his elements? Because the number of available seats was defined from the get-go. There would be 7 of them either way. So could the god claim more than one? And what would the implications for the structure of the nations be? After all, prior to the Archon War, there were a lot more gods and a lot more civilizations. All of those are questions to which I don't have the answers. Yet. But maybe you do. What's your take on all of this? I'd love to get a discussion going in the comments because this is something we need to be talking about more. And we need more lore drops about this, please Hoyoverse, I'm begging you. Oh, and if you'd like to chat more about lore and mine or your personal theories, please consider joining my Discord. The link will be in the description and in the pinned comments. That's all for today. My name is Blue and I'll see you tomorrow. Safe journey, travelers.